You are tuned to Storytelling and Beyond, the home of life-changing, emotional, and thought-provoking stories. Let's enjoy the new great motivational story. A sleek, jet-black sports car pulled up in front of an extravagant luxury showroom, its engine purring like a beast restrained. The door swung open, and out stepped Alina, the daughter of a wealthy business tycoon, draped in designer wear from head to toe. Her high heels clicked sharply against the polished pavement as she pulled down her oversized sunglasses, scanning the scene before her with a look of mild distaste. The showroom's entrance was bustling with activity. Customers in tailored suits admired the gleaming cars inside, while chauffeurs and assistants waited outside, tending to their boss's needs. But just a few feet away, disrupting the scene of elegance, was a man beneath an old, beat-up sedan, his hands covered in grease as he worked tirelessly to bring the dying engine back to life. Alina wrinkled her nose at the sight, stopping mid-step as if the mere presence of the mechanic somehow tainted the luxury surrounding her. She turned to her friend, a fellow socialite, and spoke just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Ugh, look at that," she scoffed, gesturing toward the man. "Some people just don't belong in places like this. I mean, doesn't it ruin the whole vibe? Dirty hands, dirty clothes, dirty job, so depressing." Her words sliced through the air like a dagger, making some bystanders chuckle in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably. The mechanic, still halfway under the car, paused for a moment. He heard every word. Slowly, he slid out from beneath the vehicle, revealing a young man in his late 20s, his strong features smeared with grease, his hands stained with hard work. He met Alina's gaze, but instead of anger, there was only quiet understanding in his deep, calm eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't react. He simply wiped his hands on an old rag, nodded once, and went back to work. His silence was deafening. The rich girl expected him to fight back, to protest, to lash out in frustration. But instead, he continued as if her words meant nothing. The lack of reaction unsettled her, leaving an unexpected hollowness in the triumph she thought she would feel. The laughter around her faded, and even her friend fidgeted awkwardly. A showroom manager hurried forward, nervous about the scene unfolding in front of high-profile customers. "Ms. Alina, we have the VIP lounge ready for you," he said with forced enthusiasm, eager to redirect her attention. Alina gave one last glance at the mechanic, flipping her hair over her shoulder with a smirk. "Right, let's go where we actually belong." She walked away without a second thought, oblivious to the fact that life was about to teach her a lesson she would never forget. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow over the winding country road as Alina sped along in her brand-new luxury car. The polished exterior gleamed in the fading light, a symbol of her wealth and status. She tapped her manicured fingers against the steering wheel, music blasting through the speakers as she enjoyed the solitude of the open road. The city was miles behind her now, replaced by endless stretches of land, scattered trees, and the occasional roadside shack. This was not the kind of place she frequented, but she had taken this route to avoid traffic. After all, what could go wrong in a car as expensive as hers? Then, without warning, the engine sputtered. Alina frowned, gripping the steering wheel as the car jerked slightly. A warning light blinked on the dashboard, and before she could react, the vehicle let out one final gasp and died right in the middle of nowhere. Her heart pounded with frustration as she turned the key, but the engine remained lifeless. She hit the dashboard. "You've got to be kidding me." Stepping out in her designer heels, she glanced around. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, deserted except for the occasional rustling of dry leaves in the breeze. No houses, no stores, no people, just silence. Pulling out her phone, she frowned again. No signal. She groaned in exasperation. Of all places, of all times. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like eternity. The evening air grew colder, and the once luxurious freedom of an open road now felt eerily isolating. She had always looked down on those who struggled, never imagining that she could ever find herself stranded, helpless, and dependent on someone else's kindness. Then, in the distance, the low hum of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. She turned, relief flooding her as she saw an old tow truck rolling down the road, its headlights flickering slightly. Finally! As the truck slowed down beside her, the driver's door creaked open. And then she saw him. The very mechanic she had humiliated just days ago stepped out, his familiar grease-stained hands wiping off on the same old rag. His expression remained unreadable as he took in the scene, the expensive car, the helpless girl, the irony of it all. Alina's breath hitched. A wave of discomfort rushed over her. Of all the people in the world, why him? She swallowed hard, her pride and desperation waging war inside her. Should she ask for help? Would he mock her the way she had mocked him? But as she stood there, shivering in the cool breeze, one thing became painfully clear: she had no choice. She needed him. And that realization alone sent a shiver down her spine. The silence between them stretched as the mechanic stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Alina, feeling the weight of her own arrogance pressing down on her, averted her gaze. She wasn't used to being the one in need. The uneven gravel beneath her designer heels felt unsteady, much like the situation she found herself in. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't gloat. Without a word, he bent down, popped the hood, and examined the engine with practiced ease. The glow of the setting sun cast long shadows over the roadside, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustling of trees and the quiet clicks of his tools. Alina stood awkwardly nearby, arms crossed over her chest. She had expected sarcasm, a smug remark, something to remind her of her mistake. But instead, he worked in complete silence, his calm demeanor making her shift uncomfortably. Minutes passed. She finally couldn't take it anymore. "You're not going to say anything," she blurted out, her voice sharper than intended. The mechanic paused, glancing at her for a brief moment before returning to the engine. "About what?" His voice was even, unreadable. Alina scoffed. "Oh, come on. Don't act like you don't remember. The showroom? The things I said?" She hesitated, her pride still fighting against the unfamiliar feeling of guilt. I wasn't exactly nice." He gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the truth of her words, but still said nothing. The silence felt heavier than any insult he could have thrown at her. She had expected anger. Instead, he just kept working, as if her words that day had meant nothing. As if she was insignificant. That realization stung more than she expected. Her whole life, people reacted to her. They admired her, envied her, feared her sharp tongue. But he? He simply existed, unaffected. And somehow, that made her feel even smaller. After a few more minutes, he stepped back, wiping his hands on his rag once more. "It's the fuel pump," he said. "Needs replacing." Alina frowned. "Can you fix it?" He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "I can get it running long enough to get you to a nearby repair shop." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you." The words felt foreign on her tongue. The mechanic simply nodded again and got back to work. As she watched him, something inside her shifted. For the first time, she saw him not as some poor mechanic but as a man who carried himself with quiet dignity. A man who didn't need to shout to be powerful. And for the first time in her life, Alina felt ashamed, not because she had been proven wrong, but because she had never taken the time to understand the kind of strength that didn't rely on money or status. She had spent her life looking down on people like him. But in this moment, she was the one looking up. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared back to life. The low rumble filled the empty road, breaking the eerie silence that had settled between them. Alina let out a relieved breath, but it was nothing compared to the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. She had spent her whole life believing power came from wealth, from status, from always being the one in control. But here, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a broken car and a mechanic who had every reason to humiliate her in return, she realized how wrong she had been. He closed the hood with a firm thud and wiped his hands on the same old rag. "You should be able to make it to the next town," he said, his voice calm, measured. "But don't push the engine too hard." Alina hesitated before speaking. I don't know how to thank you." The words felt strange coming from her, but they were the most honest thing she had said in a long time. The mechanic simply nodded. "Just drive safe." Something inside her wanted to say more. She wanted to explain, to apologize, to ask why he hadn't treated her the way she had treated him. But before she could find the words, he had already turned, heading back to his truck as if this was just another job. Alina watched him go, something unfamiliar tightening in her chest. She had spent years believing her world was above his, that people like him were background figures in her story. But standing there, humbled, she realized she had been living in an illusion. She got into her car, gripping the steering wheel, but for the first time, she wasn't sure where she was headed. As she drove away, she caught sight of the mechanic in her rearview mirror. He wasn't looking back. And that, more than anything, made her realize just how small she had been. The road stretched ahead, but Alina barely noticed the passing scenery. Her mind was tangled in thoughts, replaying every word, every silence, every moment of the encounter. She had expected mockery, expected a lesson delivered with the same sharp cruelty she had once used. Instead, she had been met with quiet dignity, with kindness she hadn't deserved. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her heart uneasy. For the first time, she wasn't sure who she was outside of her wealth, her status, her name. The mechanic hadn't treated her like someone important. He hadn't begged for her approval or even reacted to her insults. He had simply helped, without expectation, without pride. The small town came into view, the warm glow of streetlights breaking the darkness. She pulled into the first repair shop she saw, her car barely making it before sputtering to a final halt. As she stepped out, a man in overalls approached, but her eyes were drawn past him, to the back of the garage. There he was. The mechanic from before, wiping grease off his hands as he spoke with another customer. His expression was the same calm, focused, as if nothing had changed. As if she was just another passing moment in his day. For a reason she couldn't explain, that unsettled her more than anything. She walked toward him, her expensive heels clicking against the concrete, but this time, there was no arrogance in her steps. Just hesitation. Just the overwhelming need to say something, anything, that would ease the weight in her chest. He noticed her and raised an eyebrow. Made it here, I see. She nodded, shifting awkwardly. Yeah. Thanks to you. A pause. She swallowed. I owe you an apology. For how I acted. For what I said. She exhaled, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I was wrong. The mechanic studied her for a moment before giving a small nod, as if accepting something unspoken. Most people don't admit when they are. Alina hesitated, then let out a soft, almost nervous laugh. Yeah, well. I guess I'm learning. Another pause. Then, for the first time, she saw it, a faint, knowing smile on his face. Not smug. Not victorious. Just understanding. Without another word, he turned back to his work, moving on as if this was just another day. But Alina knew something had changed, maybe not for him, but for her. She had walked into that showroom believing silence was weakness, that kindness was something people used to beg for approval. But here, in this quiet garage, she had seen its true strength. Some lessons in life weren't taught through words but through the moments that shook everything you thought you knew. And this? This was one of those moments. This story was presented by Storytelling and Beyond, reminding viewers that every story has a lesson hidden within. If you believe in the power of life-changing stories, subscribe for more emotional, inspiring, and thought-provoking tales.